Imagine this: someone sits at their desk, endlessly rewriting a single sentence. Their screen glows at 2 a.m., the cursor blinking like a metronome for their self-doubt. They tweak the grammar, question the phrasing, delete, retype, delete again. The task was due hours ago, but something inside whispers, it's not good enough yet. And when they finally finish, they feel nothing. No relief, no satisfaction. Just a gnawing voice saying, "You could have done better." That isn't excellence. That's toxic perfectionism. And if you've ever lived in that loop of doing everything and still feeling like it's not enough, then this is your mirror.
Click subscribe to this channel to get more profound insights.
We live in a culture that glorifies perfection but doesn't understand the cost. From magazine covers to social media feeds, from resumes to report cards, we're bombarded with curated, polished versions of success. We're told to hustle harder, aim higher, and fix every flaw. But what if this constant striving isn't making us better? What if it's breaking us? Because perfectionism, as it festers in the mind, isn't a noble pursuit of excellence. It's a fear-driven obsession with avoiding failure, rejection, and shame. As the writer Anne Lamott once said, perfectionism is the voice of the oppressor, the enemy of the people. At its root, toxic perfectionism is not about being your best. It's about feeling like you're never enough no matter how much you accomplish. It starts early, often in childhood, shaped by the praise we receive and the criticism we fear. Maybe you were praised for being the smart kid, the golden child, the one who never messed up. Maybe you learned that your value was in your performance, not in your presence. So you built an identity around being exceptional. And that identity became a prison. Because now, any mistake threatens not just your work, but your sense of self. Perfectionism isn't driven by ambition. It's driven by fear. The fear of being seen as flawed. The fear of disappointing others. The fear of confirming your deepest suspicion that you're not really enough. Psychologist Brené Brown explains it perfectly. Perfectionism is a 20-ton shield that we lug around, thinking it will protect us, when in fact, it's the thing that's really preventing us from taking flight. That shield might keep criticism out, but it also keeps joy out. It keeps connection out. It keeps growth out. Let's go deeper. Why are we so afraid of imperfection? Because we've been taught that mistakes are dangerous. That if we mess up, we'll be judged, excluded, or unloved. That failure is not just an event, it's an exposure of our deepest inadequacy. And so we try to outwork it, out-polish it, out-perfect it. But perfection is not a destination. It's a mirage. You chase it endlessly, and every time you get close, it moves. Ask yourself something difficult. When was the last time you celebrated something you did without immediately thinking how it could have been better? When did you last allow yourself to feel proud without also feeling guilty for not doing more? If you're always racing toward the next goal, always haunted by the gap between your results and your expectations, you're not chasing greatness, you're running from shame. And the problem with running from shame is that it always catches up. Toxic perfectionism also convinces us that our worth is transactional, that we are only as good as our latest achievement, that rest must be earned, that our value is conditional. And over time, we start to treat ourselves not as humans, but as machines. We push through exhaustion. We reject softness. We silence our needs. We become high-functioning perfectionists, productive, impressive, and quietly suffering. As author Julia Cameron said, perfectionism is not a quest for the best. It is a pursuit of the worst in ourselves, the part that tells us that nothing we do will ever be good enough. And here's the cruel twist. Even when we succeed, we don't really feel it. Achievements don't satisfy us, they haunt us. Because the moment we reach one goal, the mind asks, what's next? There's no celebration, no pause, just pressure. Just the relentless need to prove ourselves again. We become addicted to performance, not out of joy, but out of fear. And slowly, that fear becomes who we are. Let's talk about how perfectionism isolates us. When you feel like you always have to be on, vulnerability becomes a threat. You stop asking for help. You hide your struggles. You avoid anything where you might fail publicly. And that makes you feel more alone. Because while you're trying to maintain the illusion of having it together, everyone around you is doing the same. We're all pretending, and no one is connecting. The irony is, the very thing that perfectionism promises acceptance is what it takes away. People don't fall in love with our masks. They fall in love with our humanity, with our honesty, with our willingness to be seen. When we armor ourselves with flawlessness, we block the very intimacy we crave. As Carl Rogers, one of the fathers of modern psychology, once wrote, "The curious paradox is that when I accept myself just as I am, then I can change." Perfectionism also kills creativity, because to create, you have to take risks. You have to make a mess. You have to be willing to be wrong. But perfectionism demands certainty. It demands control. It demands that you know the outcome before you even begin. So instead of starting, you stall. Instead of experimenting, you overanalyze. Instead of expressing, you suppress. And the world never gets to see what you might have made because you were too afraid to make it imperfectly. Perfectionism is often born from chaos. Maybe you grew up in a home where love was unstable, where mistakes had consequences, where performance was survival. So you learned to control what you could, your grades, your behavior, your image. That control gave you safety, but it also gave you anxiety. Because now, anything outside your control feels like a threat. And life, by definition, is outside your control. And when control is your coping mechanism, letting go feels like death. But it's not death, it's freedom. Because the truth is, you were never meant to be perfect. You were meant to be real, to feel things, and to mess up, to grow. Perfectionism robs you of your right to evolve. It says, be flawless now, or don't even try. But growth says, start where you are flawed, messy, human, and keep going. So what do? We start by recognizing that perfectionism is a belief system, not a personality trait, not a fixed truth. And beliefs can be challenged. They can be changed. You can start to notice the voice in your head that says, not enough, and ask, says who? You can start to question the rules you've been living by. I can rest only if I've earned it. I can't make mistakes. I must always be strong. And you can start to replace those rules with something more human, more kind, more real. Because the opposite of perfectionism isn't failure. It's freedom. Freedom to show up. Freedom to try. Freedom to be seen. And that freedom doesn't begin when you finally become flawless. It begins the moment you realize you don't have to be. Toxic perfectionism is a psychological parasite. It doesn't just live in your thoughts, it eats your joy, your spontaneity, your ability to breathe. And worst of all, it wears disguises. It pretends to be ambition. It pretends to be discipline. It pretends to be self-respect. But underneath the surface, it's driven by insecurity, by shame, by the belief that if you're not perfect, you don't deserve to belong, that if you're not flawless, you're fundamentally flawed. And until we strip away that mask, we keep feeding a beast that was never meant to rule us. One of the most dangerous lies perfectionism whispers is this: once you're perfect, then you'll be happy. Then you'll be safe. Then people will love you. But it's never true. Because perfection is a moving target. You fix one thing, another flaw appears. You hit one goal, another expectation rises. That's why author Elizabeth Gilbert said, perfectionism is just fear in fancy shoes and a mink coat, pretending to be elegant when actually it's just terrified. And that fear never leaves until you stop feeding it. Let's examine how perfectionism affects our relationships. When we demand perfection from ourselves, we often demand it from others too. Not because we're cruel, but because we're scared. We think, if I have to hold myself to this impossible standard, then so should you. So we become hypercritical, judgmental, controlling, and we push people away not because we don't need them, but because we're afraid they'll see the mess we're hiding. And if they see the mess, maybe they'll walk away. So we try to perfect everything before letting anyone in. But perfection is a wall, not a window. This is why vulnerability is terrifying for perfectionists. Because vulnerability says, here I am, imperfect and real. And when you're trained to believe that flaws equal unworthiness, being vulnerable feels like exposure, like danger. But here's the paradox. The more you hide your imperfections, the more disconnected you become. From others, from your own self, from life. As Leonard Cohen famously wrote, there is a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in. But perfectionism doesn't allow cracks. It tries to seal them shut until the pressure builds and everything shatters. Perfectionists often live in a constant state of anxiety. Not the kind that's easy to detect, not panic attacks or breakdowns, but a chronic, low-grade hum of tension. The mind is always scanning. Am I doing enough? Did I say the right thing? What did they think of that? Should I have done more? This inner noise becomes the soundtrack of your life. And even in moments of success, you can't relax. Because your nervous system is waiting for the next mistake, the next judgment, the next fall. Over time, this takes a toll not just mentally, but physically. Chronic stress leads to burnout, insomnia, digestive issues, immune dysfunction. The body keeps score, as Dr. Bessel van der Kolk puts it. And the perfectionist body is often in a constant state of fight or flight. Because when your identity is tied to your output, rest becomes dangerous. Rest feels like falling behind. like losing control. But what if rest is not a luxury but a rebellion? What if rest is the way we return to ourselves? There's also a deep existential loneliness that lives inside toxic perfectionism. Because when you're always performing, no one truly knows you. People see your polished act, your curated image, your highlight reel. But they don't see your doubt, your fear, your mess. Not because they don't want to, but because you don't let them. And over time, you begin to believe that if people really knew you, they wouldn't stay. So you keep hiding, keep performing, keep wondering why you feel so alone even when you're surrounded. And yet, what we crave most is connection. Real, messy, human connection. The kind that happens when we say, "I don't have it all together." The kind that happens when we admit, "I'm scared." The kind that happens when we let someone see us not as perfect, but as real. That's where healing begins. As Brené Brown reminds us, imperfections are not inadequacies. They are reminders that we're all in this together. But perfectionism isolates us with the false promise of approval and disconnects us from the truth of shared humanity. Let's talk now about achievement, because perfectionists are often high achievers, driven, focused, productive, and society rewards that. You get praise, promotions, applause. But what people don't see is the cost. The sleepless nights, the self-doubt, the emotional numbness, the inability to celebrate yourself. Achievement becomes a drug. You need the next win to feel okay. But it never lasts, because no external validation can fill an internal void. And here's the tragedy: perfectionists often sabotage themselves. They procrastinate not because they're lazy, but because they're afraid. Afraid that if they really try, and it's not perfect, it'll confirm their worst fear that they're not enough. So they delay. They avoid. They lose opportunities. And then they blame themselves, not realizing that perfectionism didn't drive them forward, it held them hostage. And the chains are invisible until you name them. So what's the way out? It starts with radical honesty. You have to admit that the rules you're living by are killing your spirit. That the voice in your head isn't a coach, it's a critic. That perfection isn't love, it's fear wearing a mask. And once you name that, you can begin to challenge it. You can begin to ask, who taught me I had to be perfect to be loved? What would happen if I let myself be seen as I really am? Then comes the practice. Because healing perfectionism isn't a one-time decision. It's a daily practice of choosing self-compassion over self-judgment, of choosing progress over perfection, or of choosing connection over performance. It means allowing yourself to rest, to play, to be messy, to show up anyway. And yes, it feels terrifying at first, but it also feels like freedom. You begin to rewrite your identity not as the perfect one, but as the whole one. You start to trust that your value is not in what you do, but in who you are. And that trust changes everything. You no longer need to prove yourself in every room. You no longer need to earn rest or love or peace. You begin to live from a place of worthiness, not scarcity. And that shift is what breaks the cycle. Think of the people who inspire you most. Are they perfect or are they real? Think of the moments that moved you. Were they flawless? Or were they filled with truth? Perfectionism is a performance, but truth is a revolution. And the world doesn't need more perfect people. It needs more people who are brave enough to be seen. As Rumi said, "You were born with wings. Why prefer to crawl through life?" Perfectionism clips those wings in the name of control. But you were not born to be flawless. You were born to fly. And sometimes, to fly, you have to fall. You have to try. You have to be willing to be seen in all your glorious imperfection. There's a moment in every perfectionist's journey, usually quiet, usually late, when they realize the cost of the performance. The endless striving, the sleepless nights, the inability to enjoy the very things they've worked so hard to achieve. And in that moment, there's a question that breaks through the noise. If I stopped trying to be perfect, who would I be? It sounds simple, but for someone who's built their entire identity around being flawless, it can feel like death. Because perfectionism isn't just a habit, it's a mask glued to the skin. And peeling it off means facing what's underneath: the fear, the shame, the truth. But here's what we discover when we finally take the risk. Underneath perfectionism isn't weakness. It's longing. A longing to be accepted. A longing to be safe. A longing to be loved, not for what we do, but for who we are. As the poet E.E. Cummings wrote, "To be nobody but yourself in a world which is doing its best, night and day. To make you everybody else means to fight the hardest battle which any human being can fight. That battle is where healing begins." The healing of perfectionism doesn't begin with achievement. It begins with surrender, with saying, "I am willing to be seen. I am willing to be messy. I am willing to be wrong and still worthy." And that surrender can look like 1,000 small revolutions. Saying "I don't know" in a meeting. Leaving a dish in the sink overnight. Sharing a project before it's perfect. Admitting you're tired. Letting someone see you cry. These aren't signs of failure, they're signs of courage. Because every time you choose real over perfect, you take your power back. You begin to realize that the people who truly love you aren't here for the polished version. They're here for the real one. The one who laughs too loud, and who sometimes forgets, who messes up and owns it, who is beautifully, bravely human. And the deeper truth is this: when you allow yourself to be seen in your imperfection, you give others permission to do the same. You become a safe space, a mirror, a light in a world full of filters. Let's talk about failure. Perfectionism treats failure like poison. But what if failure is actually medicine? What if your most painful mistakes are your greatest teachers? What if the things you're most ashamed of are the seeds of your strength? Thomas Edison once said, "I have not failed. I've just found 10,000 ways that won't work." That's not just creative thinking, it's spiritual resilience. Because when you stop tying your worth to your outcomes, you become unstoppable. Not because you always succeed, but because you're no longer afraid to try. And when you let go of the need to be perfect, something radical happens. You start enjoying your life. You start laughing more, resting more, creating more, connecting more. Because now, you're not living for approval, you're living for truth. And truth is where meaning lives. Not in flawless execution, but in authentic expression. Think about the most powerful art, the most moving stories, the most unforgettable people? Were they perfect or were they honest? Did they follow a script or did they speak from the soul? Perfectionism is about control, but truth is about connection. And in the end, connection is what we're all aching for. You weren't born to be a machine. You were born to be a mosaic, a masterpiece made of light and shadow, strength and softness, clarity and confusion. You were never meant to be perfect. You were meant to be whole. As Leonard Cohen reminded us, again and again, there is a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in. Your cracks are not your shame. They are your story, your power, your invitation to be fully alive. So how do we keep walking this path? We stop waiting for the fear to go away. We walk with it. We let it sit beside us, but we don't let it drive. We show up. We speak up. We create. We rest. We breathe. And when the voice of perfectionism whispers, "Not enough," we answer with compassion. We say, "I am enough," even now, especially now. And we remember that healing is not linear. Some days we'll fall back into old patterns. We'll overthink, overwork, overperform. That's okay. That's part of the process. The goal is not to never struggle. The goal is to struggle less alone, less ashamed, more awake. Because the opposite of perfectionism isn't laziness. It's presence. It's the ability to show up in your life not as a flawless version of yourself, but as the full version. The version who can say no. The version who can rest. The version who can make something imperfect and still call it beautiful. That's where your life begins again. So here's the question to carry with you. What would your life look like if you believed you were already enough? Not after the next success, not after the next fix, but right now, as you are. Can you feel the weight that would lift? The breath that would return? The peace that would come home? That peace is your birthright. That freedom is your inheritance. Not because you earned it, but because you exist. And maybe, just maybe, the most radical act of perfection is to stop trying to be perfect and start being you. The world doesn't need your perfection. It needs your presence, your humanity, your courage, your heart. And when you give yourself permission to be imperfect, you don't just heal yourself, you create a space where others can heal too. So take off the mask, lay down the armor, and come home to yourself. That's where the real life is waiting. That's where the light gets in.